In language learning, we often try to find ways to measure our progress and indicate whereabout we're currently at in our learning journey. The most common way to do this is to go by CEFR level or by other standardized metrics or tests like the JLPT for Japanese, the TOPIK for Korean, or the DIL for Spanish. On a slightly more abstract level, we can also use the number of words we know to indicate how much progress we've made or whereabout we're currently at in our learning journey. I'm sure we've all heard different numbers thrown around on the internet to measure progress to different milestones. Whether that's 1,000 words to reach an intermediate level, 10,000 words to pass a certain language test, 20,000 to be fluent, 40,000 as the size of a native speaker's vocabulary, or 500,000 words existing in a given language. At first glance, there's nothing particularly wrong with these estimates or with using known words as a metric in general. Thinking about it just a little more, however, there are some things that need clarification. Like who even comes up with these numbers and on what basis? Is the definition of word the same in one language as it is in another? What about words with multiple meanings? And then there's also always the question what it even means to know a word. How do we know that we know a word? In other words, there are two problems with the known word metric, the known and the word. I want to first have a look at what a word is, because the term is actually quite ambiguous. Look at these sentences and tell me how many words you count. I like words. My favorite word is word. I like it a lot. On a surface level, there are 13 words in these 3 sentences. But if we think in the sense of knowing words in a foreign language, then if you know a word the first time, you'll probably also know it 2 sentences later. So since I, like, and word appear twice, there are only 10 unique words in these sentences. This is what we call the token type distinction. A token is every single word that appears in a text. A type is only the unique forms of a word in a text. So when we write an essay or we read a book, we want to count the total number of words that we wrote or read, so we want to count the tokens. But when it comes to how many words we know, it obviously doesn't make sense to count every single word we ever encountered, or we would end up with over 1 million known words by the time we finish reading Harry Potter. So counting word types makes more sense then, or does it? While you can certainly argue that this is the case, think about words like love, lover, lovely, lovable, unlovable. They all have the same base word love in common, and if you know some English, you'll know that the ER ending indicates a person doing the X. Adding ly turns the word into an adverb. Adding able indicates that something is capable to be X'd, and adding an un to that means that something is incapable to be X'd. These attachments are called affixes, and even though you may not be consciously aware of it, they follow certain patterns and work on practically all words. A pronder is someone who prawns, and the pronder does this very promptly. But maybe sometimes he overprawns and things become a little dispronded, or unprondable. Even though prawn is a totally made-up word, you're able to understand how these derivatives relate to the base word because you recognize the patterns that we commonly find in real words. By adding affixes like un, re, over, or ness, meant, itty, we're able to change the meaning of the base word and change words from one word class into another. Since we have these affixes and they generally speaking behave the same, does it really make sense to consider love, lover, and lovely as separate words? Wouldn't it make more sense to just group them together under one base term, like love? This is what we call a lemma, and you could certainly argue that it is the better way to count words. The only problem we run into when counting words by lemmas rather than types is that it is not always clear where a word comes from. Think about irregular verbs in English, for example. Just because a learner might know that go and goes are related doesn't mean they can guess the same for went. I mean, look at it. It looks nothing alike. And then there are words like hard and hardly that look alike but mean very different things. Just like to soften means to make something softer, but to fasten doesn't mean to make something faster. I would argue that there is no right or wrong way to count words and indicate how many words you know, as long as you're aware of the implications of the metric you're using. By using word types, your word count will grow very quickly, especially in languages with many inflections, like Spanish, for example, because each conjugation will essentially add to your word count. This will make it basically pointless to do cross-language comparisons. With lemmas, your word count will naturally be a lot smaller, because the assumption is that you can derive other words from the lemmas you know. So a comparison between languages, at least from the same language family, can be somewhat reasonable. Unfortunately, different platforms, institutes, and websites use different metrics without really clarifying what they mean when they talk about how many words you may need to know for this or that, or when tracking your language learning progress. That is, by the way, also one of the reasons why you will see vastly different estimates of how many words a native speaker of a language knows. Speaking of which, this was only the first part of the problem. We just discussed the problem with words. Let's now move on to what it means to know a word. And for the sake of not getting omega confused in this next part, let's just agree that words are counted by word types. So love, lover, and lovely are 3 separate words. To many people, knowing a word or knowing anything really is just a feeling, because either you know it or you don't, right? For language learning specifically, I don't think it's quite as black and white, because there are many components to knowing a word that we don't usually actively think about. Researcher Paul Nation came up with a great overview for everything that goes into knowing a word that I would love to introduce to you. According to him, knowing a word can be categorized into 3 broader categories: form, meaning, and use, with each of these categories having another 3 subcategories. I'm not going to go into detail for every single one, but let's have a look. The first broader category is called form, and when linguists talk about form, they usually refer to the real-world realization of that word, like the pronunciation being the spoken form and the spelling being the written form of a word. Nation further subdivides into receptive and productive skills, which in simple terms just means being able to understand and being able to produce or make yourself. For pronunciation, for example, that would be being able to understand the word when it is spoken and being able to pronounce it yourself. For writing, that would be being able to read the word and being able to write it yourself. The second category in his overview is called meaning, which refers more to what's going on inside of our heads when we see or use certain words. Form and meaning refers to the connection between the word, the real-world realization of the word, and the mental concept that comes up. When you heard the word prawn earlier, you were able to hear it and could probably spell it out for me. But there's no meaning connection to any concept in your mind because it's a made-up word. When you hear dog, however, that word means something to you because there's a concept attached to the word. And when I say dogs, that again is a slightly different mental concept. Next up in this category is concept and reference, which is a really interesting concept that I made a whole separate video about recently. It essentially describes the phenomenon of one word having multiple meanings or concepts attached to it, and also knowing the exact limitations of them. An example I gave in my other video was lemonade and the German translation Limonade. Even though they're exact translations of each other, German and US lemonade are 2 very different things. And so a German thinking of lemonade will have a very different concept in mind than an American. Finally, associations, which to me sounds like synonyms and antonyms and other words in a similar category or field. Like when I say green, what's the first thing that comes to mind kind of deal. The last category in Nation's overview is called use, and sounds a bit like the pragmatic side of knowing a word. Grammatical function, I think, is pretty obvious and just refers to which grammatical category a word belongs to and how that constrains the word usage. You can say word by a house because word is not a pronoun, but blank by a house requires a pronoun in the blank position. Not he, she, or it though, because then it would be bys. This knowledge does not need to be explicit because honestly, who walks around remembering word classes for different words? It's just important that you know which patterns a word follows and in what way you can use it in a sentence. Knowing collocations means knowing which words are likely to appear together. For example, you are more likely to hear "I made a mistake" than "I did a mistake," or "a piece of advice" than "a chunk of advice" or "a slice of advice." Though I would kind of like that one. Finally, constraints on use means knowing which words to choose in a given situation based on factors like the setting, the people around you, the person you're talking to, the topic you're talking about, and the word itself. Think, for example, of words like rich or wealthy versus loaded, or broke versus poor. We can also often see a distinction in written versus spoken language, where word pairs like so and therefore, or start and commence exist. I think these 9 areas cover pretty much everything you could think of in terms of knowing a word. But the question remains, at which point do you actually know the word? Is it enough to know 3 of those things? Half of them? Or do you perhaps have to have all of those boxes checked to really know a word? Some perfectionists might argue that this is the case, but I think that word knowledge is a little more dynamic than that, and that the expectations we have for our own word knowledge should change as we learn more about the language. As beginners, we mostly focus on the spoken and/or written form of the word, the connection between form and meaning, and to a certain extent also its grammatical function. I would consider these the very basic foundational building blocks necessary to even acknowledge a word as a word. Because if someone gives you a few scribbles on a paper, but you're not even able to recognize it as writing with actual words, let alone gather any meaning from it, can we really say you understand the scribbles to be words then? No, not really. At the same time though, nobody would expect a beginner to be aware of all the nuances of a word, to have learned all the idioms it appears in, or to know all its synonyms and antonyms. These things come a lot later, and they have to build up over time. You can't learn collocations without seeing a word multiple, if not hundreds of times in similar contexts being used together with those other words. So as we get better and we ideally have more exposure to the language, we start building a network of concepts and reference and associations and collocations to neatly organize the world around us into words and to then attach more and more information to those words. And this process never really ends. As long as you keep seeking out new content, you will always come across new words, word senses that you didn't know about before, or nuances that you weren't aware of. As you can see, there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to the known word metric, but as long as you know what you're measuring and why, it doesn't really matter what some online article says about how many words you need to know to do X, Y, and Z. Personally, I love the known word metric. Both on Link and Migaku, it has been a big motivator for me to keep reading just so I can see that number climb a little higher. And that is even though Link and Migaku have a very different understanding of how to parse language and count words, and the difference in my reading level between Dutch and Japanese. What can I say? I wasn't lying when I said I loved words. It's great knowing a lot of them, and how do you learn them? By reading, which I also love. It's a win-win. I hope you enjoyed the video and ideally you learned something as well. And I'll see you in the next video, which I promise won't be about linguistics.